desert bighorn sheep, so it's kind of cool to come up here and see something that's green that doesn't have stickers on it. I'd like to introduce Larry Williams today. Larry is originally from the North Alabama, where he grew up visiting Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge. He studied wildlife management at Auburn University, where he graduated in 1991. While in college, Larry began working with the Fish and Wildlife Service as a volunteer at Eufaula Refuge, and eventually he became a SCEP student. His 22 years with the service has included working at many refuges, including San Marcos, Carolina Sandhills, Sacramento. In 2004, Larry moved to the service headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, where he currently works in the headquarters office. Positions including communications, planning, policy, and budget. He is currently chief of the Refuge System Division of Budget, Performance, and Workforce. Larry's pastimes include hunting, fishing, natural history, art, and creative writing. He and his wife, Claire, have 3 children, Janelle, Olivia, and Daniel, and the family currently lives in Chantilly, Virginia. I'd like to welcome Larry this morning.
Thanks, Kobe, and welcome everybody. This is great to see such a large crowd here. I think we're going to have some wonderful discussions, and I'm glad you're all here, and I want everybody to take part in these discussions. We've set this up to be a candid discussion about the roles that refuge managers will have in the future and the skills that they'll need to fill those roles. We've got a really diverse panel of speakers here, and I'd like to introduce them. First, we have Keenan Adams. Keenan recently became the Deputy Refuge Manager at the Pelican Island Refuge Complex. He began his refuge system career in 2008 at Carolina Sandhills Refuge, one of my old hangouts. Keenan earned his bachelor's degree from Furman University, and then he completed both a master's and a PhD at Clemson. At Clemson, Keenan's projects focused on the impact of clear-cut harvesting on riparian birds and the human dimensions of forest and wildlife management and the land ethic. So how about a big round of applause for Dr. Keenan Adams. Next, we have Vicki Muller. Vicki grew up on 22 acres of deciduous hardwoods in the Northeast Ohio, where she trained English Springer Spaniels for hunting competitions. Her love for the outdoors has fueled her career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Vicki started as a volunteer at Browns Park Refuge, and from there she became a SCEP student. Her career has taken her to many refuges, including Audubon, Red Rock Lakes, Bedoin, and Calm Wetland Management District. Vicki is now a refuge specialist at Aransas Refuge in Texas, and she feels thankful every day to be working for such a passionate and meaningful agency. Please welcome Vicki Muller. Next is Shaun Sanchez. Shaun is currently the refuge manager at the Desert Refuge Complex in Nevada. Over his career, Shaun has worked in 6 states and on 11 different refuges, including Bosque del Apache in New Mexico, Anahuac in Texas, and more recently, the Yukon Delta Refuge in Alaska. Shaun and his wife, Maria, have 5 children. The family loves wildlife and the outdoors, and they spend their free time hunting and fishing or doing anything that gets them outside. How about a warm welcome for Shaun Sanchez? And next we have Don Hultman. Don received a bachelor's degree in communications and wildlife management and a master's degree in education from the University of Minnesota. All of that after serving a tour in the U.S. Marine Corps. Don spent 30 years working for refuges in Minnesota, Michigan, North Dakota, and Montana as a supervisor in the Twin Cities Regional Office and as Deputy Chief of Refuges in Washington, D.C. Don's last assignment was manager of the four-state, 240,000-acre Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge based in Minnesota. Don retired in June of 2009. Before his retirement, Don received the Refuge Manager of the Year Award and the Department of Interior's Meritorious Service Award. How about a warm welcome for Mr. Don Hultman? So because we're going to squeeze what was going to be a 1.5-hour session into an hour, we're going to try to pick up the pace so that we've got plenty of time to have questions and some dialogue. So as moderator of the workshop, I was asked to give a few ideas about types of change that we see happening in the refuge system. So I've got 3 basic elements of change that I'm going to go over, and as soon as I'm done, each of the panel members is going to make a short presentation. So the 3 types of change that I want to set the stage with. First is demographic change. Second is changes in our education and our training. And finally, changes in our tools and our technology. So first, talking about demographic change. What you see here is a chart that represents the sort of the racial statistics within the Refuge Manager series, everybody in the 0485 series. So there's about 650 employees in that series, and the red column is the number of employees that are white, and the blue column is the number of employees that are of a minority. So I thought that was a pretty interesting chart, and it's a little heavy on one side. So with this chart, we add a little more information. In the middle is the column that you just saw, 2011, that's right now. On the left is 1999, 12 years ago, and on the right is what we call the civilian labor force demographic. The civilian labor force is kind of the gold standard in workforce diversity, and that's what agencies tend to use as a target or goal when they're measuring their progress towards increased diversity in a workforce. So I think looking at those charts, you can see that slowly we're moving towards the same demographic as the overall civilian labor force. It's happening very slowly, but it is happening, and it's happening all the time. Now this chart takes what was the blue bar on the other charts that just said minority and breaks it down into the 6 categories that we track as race or national origin. And you can see there, this is 1999 and the present, 2011. And you can see a little bit of change there. For instance, you can see an increase in the number of blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Hawaiian/Pacific Islanders, and in the number of people who claim 2 or more races. It's also interesting that there was a decrease in the number of Native Americans over that time. So the only point that I want to make with these slides is that there is change going on in the racial national origin makeup of the Refuge Manager series. Now this is an interesting chart too. This is the gender makeup within that same 650 pool of people. And again, you can see a slow change. The blue bar is the number of women, the red bar is the number of men, the blue bars are rising, the red bars are going down, and again, on the far right is the civilian labor force. So I think it's safe to say we're headed towards that. It's interesting too that the rate of change here is faster than the rate of change with the minority statistics. So in other words, we're bringing women into the pool of refuge managers at a faster rate than we're bringing in minorities. And these are really all the statistics that I have on demographics, and my only point is we're changing. We're changing slowly, we're changing constantly. We can kind of see what we're changing towards, but we are changing. So now I want to talk about education and training. The other day, Charlie Paliza was telling us about the wonderful project he's working on in Florida, the Everglades headwaters, and trying to establish a new refuge there. This is a map of that project. I got this map from the internet. And what I'd like to point out about this map is that it's a pretty good example of us trying to connect some existing conservation lands. So the dull green areas there in the middle, you probably can't read them because it's a small font, but the headings there are places like Kissimmee Prairie State Park, Avon Park Air Force Range, Lake Wales Ridge State Forest, and on and on. And now if you look at the bright colors on the map, you should read those the same way you would read a weather radar. So in other words, the red is the really hot stuff. That's the high priority habitat. That's the stuff that we most need to protect. And you know, there it is in bright colors, pretty clear. I think that's a pretty cool map, and I know if I was going to meet with a county supervisor or a member of Congress, I'd feel pretty confident going in with a map like this. Here's another map. This is the most recently approved refuge, new refuge in the system, the Flint Hills Legacy Conservation Area in Kansas. Another wonderful project. And this is a quote from the LPP that accompanied that project. I'm just going to read it. Within the priority 1 and 2 areas, selection of parcels for acquisition will be based on providing protection of a mosaic of 10,000 acre parcels separated by a maximum distance of 20 miles to prevent genetic isolation. So I know that sounds really technical, but the point I wanted to make is we're learning how to create networks and patchworks of protected lands, and we're learning how to assemble these things with real strategy. You can see that in the map, you can see that in the math that we're using. And I expect a lot of you heard about the recent change in the education requirements for becoming a refuge manager, and the fact that now there's a requirement for 3 semester hours of conservation biology. That's a reflection of us learning to do this kind of work and having this really rock-solid strategy for where we're going to protect the next acre of ground. And you can see that changes related to this are popping up in Refuge Academy. If you look in the Refuge Academy curriculum, you can see that now there's sessions on conservation biology. There are sessions on working across landscapes and working with neighbors. We do this kind of work really good, and it's starting to show up in our training and in our education. So the last area of change I want to talk about is in tools and technology. Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, Ann does. Maybe a few others. Dean. So this is Jack Watson. Jack was the first refuge manager of the Key Deer Refuge in Florida, which was established in 1957. So the key deer were being poached by American hunters and by fishermen coming over from Cuba. Poaching was the big problem there. And Jack Watson was the perfect man for the job. From what I've read, Jack was a really kind man. He actually nursed several injured key deer back to health, and he would reintroduce them to the wild. But he was kind of like cheap toilet paper. He didn't take crap off nobody. And if you look on his right hip there, you see the hammer from his revolver. And if you look a little further down, you see he's got a cigar. So I think Jack was the right man for the job, and I've got I admire him quite a bit. But I sometimes wonder if we rolled the clock back to 1950 and we were to ask Jack, well, actually, let's say we were to tell him, you know, Jack, before too long, every one of us is going to have a little device that takes pictures and sends messages, and you can even use it to check the weather. And what do you think Jack would have said? I think he would have said something like, boy, you've been reading too many of them Dick Tracy comic books. Because that used to be the stuff of comic books not too long ago. And how many people in the room have one of these? So, certainly our tools and our technology are changing a lot. Okay, I'm going to wind it down. Here's another real interesting statistic. So that same pool of 650 people in the Refuge Manager Series, this chart breaks them down into when they're going to be eligible to retire. And up in the right-hand corner, those wedges that are bright, that's everybody who will be eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And it's 200 out of the pool of about 650. So my point here, there's a lot of change coming. We've got a lot of wonderful veterans that are going to be, separating from the refuge system, but there's a lot of change coming too. So each one of these pictures came from a national wildlife refuge, and I just wanted to put this up to sort of re-emphasize, let's do our best to grow the best new managers for the future. And that's all I have to say. Next, we're going to get Dr. Keenan Adams up here to tell us a little more about what he thinks about the refuge manager of the future.
Thank you, Larry. I'm humbled to be standing in front of you in this room, and I'm humbled to be on the panel of the many esteemed refuge managers. And kudos to Jim Kerr for recommending me on this panel. Gave a great speech yesterday, but I can't really talk about my vast refuge experiences. I've only been permanent for 6 months, so I'll just tell you a bit about myself. I cut my teeth at Carolina Sandhills and been located at Pelican Island now for 6 months. I can tell you the parallels of my story to the refuge manager of the future. I grew up in a beautiful longleaf pine stand. Sorry. I grew up in a beautiful longleaf pine stand. You messed it up, Larry. With a black creek meandering through the hardwood bottom. And I like to you envision me as a kid in this beautiful longleaf pine stand. Me as a kid. Think about it. Now, I had hair back then, not a bald head 6-year-old, but, as Larry showed you, this is the longleaf pine stand that I grew up in. A bit poetic that my first refuge was at Carolina Sandhills that we restored longleaf pine. Here's the creek. Prior to the microstesium infestation, I played there daily. I remember one time we caught about 100 crawdads in this creek, and we scurried up a bunch of nickels and dimes and went to the payphone. This is pre-cell phones. I'm not that young. And we called Red Lobster and asked them if they would like to buy them. True story. This is my nephew looking over the creek bottom in the neighborhood and the hardwood bottom, and that's the football field. I learned to play football. And this is an apartment complex where the poor people lived at from my elementary school. I was one of those poor kids, and adjacent to us was a Section 8 housing. And I regret not scanning this picture. Jim wanted me to share this with you. I have a picture when I talk to elementary school kids. There's 4 of us, and it's this picture of us. I might have been 12, and I said, this is Travis, he's dead. This is Taiwan, he's serving 25 to life. And this is Bobby, he's dead, and this is me. I'm a wildlife biologist. Just to hit home a point. I didn't share that for applause, but just to let you know that we all have a story. And this segues to my first point. The manager of the future may come from an urban-suburban interface, and this is an example of the changing demographics on a spatial scale. Simply put, there will be more people in urban areas in the future. We also must consider the change in demographics in regards to ethnicity. How are we going to teach the conservation ethic to different cultures? But better yet, are we willing to learn the conservation ethic of different cultures and find where we overlay? Where is that 80% that we discussed that we agree upon, and can we build from there? This issue is a people issue, human dimensions as it's called in academia. The manager of the future must have people skills. The literature is vast and expansive about the critters and their subsequent habitat. We know what they're doing. But the manager of the future must have people skills. People skills for personnel management, people skills for partnerships with conservation agencies, and people skills for working with the public. My supervisor, mentor, and friend, Charlie Paliza, warns, though, that we not get caught too much in people skills where we forget wildlife management. It has to be a balance between both. And speaking of Charlie, hey Charlie, been fortunate to have a great person to jumpstart my career with. As you saw from his speech, Charlie's a visionary. I was fortunate to have Lynn Askins, hey Lynn, where are you? Who was a great mentor at SCEP, and she would take me to the woodshed when I messed up and give me a hug afterwards. And it's good to have people like that in your life. Maury Bedford took me under his wings, now a mentor for me, just as Dr. Toga did for him. David Viker has been an inspiration to me, and has talked to me daily. Dean Rundle. He is why I'm here, actually. We met in a conference in Denver, and he wanted me to get out to Wyoming to be a bird biologist, and I wasn't interested in working in Wyoming, but he made sure before I got home that Region 4 knew of me and got me into the SCEP program. But I would not be here without my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Perry, who started noticing I was sleeping in class and asked why. And I told him, well, I played college football, and so I had to get home, and got home at 8 o'clock, and I actually worked on Sundays and Tuesday and Wednesday nights at Pep Boys, changing tires to help support my family back home. And so on Mondays and Thursdays, he would stay with me late and help me get through some of the problems I was having in class, and made a big investment. I mean, this is to my last point, that we need mentors. The refuge managers of the future need skills that you guys have from seasoned veterans like yourself. So I challenge you to invest time in the GS 579 Wildlife Refuge Specialist that's on your refuge. And I invite you to join our conversation today about the tools that will be required. So I'll close. The manager of the future will come from unconventional places, such as longleaf pine stands in the middle of a city, and they could use guidance and mentorships, and they need people skills. Thank you.
Thanks, Keenan, for those excellent comments. Next, we have Vicki Muller.
Thanks, Larry. So I started out as a kid training bird dogs for hunting competitions in rural Ohio. I learned early on a way to develop my own training style was by talking to as many trainers as I possibly could and pick their brains. I then took pieces that I thought would work for me, and I created my own style. This love for the outdoors led me to enter wildlife management at Ohio State University. One of those summers, I volunteered at Browns Park National Wildlife Refuge, and this was my first introduction to the refuge system. Let me tell you, I was really hooked. The manager had a knack for empowering all of the staff and volunteers. For example, at staff meetings, a situation would be brought up and we would go around the table and get everyone's opinion, including myself as a volunteer. Then at the next meeting, the decision was announced, and for whatever reason, it was explained, and you felt like regardless of the decision, you had an input, and that has really stuck with me throughout this time. Even as a volunteer, I had learned the sense of empowerment. I was given a project to accomplish, and then the ability to lead a team, which gave me a sense of responsibility and ownership. He had my complete buy-in because I knew that even as a student volunteer, I was making a difference. As you can see, I had a great start to my career. This led to the SCEP program, where I worked and lived in some amazing places in Region 6. The SCEP program really fits in well for refuge managers, as I was moved to 3 different stations and was exposed to a variety of issues and experiences throughout that time. I was shown early on the importance of moving, so I bring up the future of the moving policy to be considered. We need to support the idea that managers should move to obtain a diverse experience with refuges and regions. I like to use that same philosophy from when I was a kid training dogs. There are positive aspects that you can pull from all stations and all managers. You can pick out those traits and actions that you want to emulate. An important aspect that has guided my career has been having a mentor. This person has helped shape me as an individual as well as guide me down my career path. What started out as a professional relationship has grown into a personal friendship. The idea of having an unbiased individual to bounce ideas off of outside of my field station, I have found to be invaluable. So I'd recommend to anyone starting out in your career to keep your eyes peeled for someone reaching out to you. Grasp onto that opportunity, and you will both reap the rewards of all of your work. And I dare throw out another topic that came up as being on the core team for relevancy to a Changing America section of the vision document. In this time of change, the idea of using creative ways to bring the communities out to our refuges is something we need to consider. By this, I mean the possibility of interpreting the appropriate use policy with more flexibility. Now, I don't want to suggest this at the detriment of the wildlife. That always has to come first. What I mean is evaluating certain situations and allowing some of them that could be outside of the Big Six to occur. An example may be sponsoring a 5K run on a refuge. This will bring the people out to the refuge and then give us the opportunity to interpret our message to them and let them experience their refuges, what their refuges have to offer. After all, they're their refuges. I'm not trying to stir the pot, but I do believe it may be worth discussing. So in closing, look for those people throughout your career who model the traits and characteristics that you desire to have. Get to know them, learn from them, and as you develop your own management style, get diverse experiences, and you too will have a successful career. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. A little challenge there on our appropriate use policy. That's good. Stretch ourselves. Next, we have Mr. Shaun Sanchez.
Good morning. So when I was asked to talk about the refuge manager of the future, we got together, we talked about all the various issues and concerns and things that we face as refuge managers, and thought, okay, well, I can talk about things like increased administrative workloads, spending time at a computer, all of the things that seem to take up much of our time now. And I thought, well, you all know about that. You know that we sit behind a computer a lot of time. We communicate via email. Those are just some of the tools of the trade right now. As I really started to think about it, I became more and more concerned about my responsibility and where the refuge manager of the future is going to come from. I am much more concerned on what are the things that I am doing right now that are going to make it so that there are refuge managers in the future. How are we going to be able to have those folks that are out there protecting those special places that we all care about? So in doing that, I looked at where I came from. I grew up on a ranch in northern New Mexico, very kind of blue-collar background. My dad was a welder, my mom was a bookkeeper slash secretary for various places. We raised cattle, pigs, sheep, I mean, you name it, kind of grew up with that type of background. Did hunting and fishing, spent my days off, school breaks, Christmas breaks, things like that. If I can get my mom to drop me off at the lake on the way to work and my dad to pick me up on the way home, I loved it because I spent all day at the lake fishing. My most cherished times were when I was out hunting. We lived on a refuge in northern New Mexico in the mountains, but we really went up into the mountains much further away from the ranch and would go deer and elk hunting a lot of times. And I loved it so much that as a kid, I noticed Sunday afternoon comes along and camp starts to get packed up. We're starting to pack up camp and getting ready to go back home so that my dad can go to work during the week. Well, I noticed this really young, and I would go and I'd grab his keys, go jump in the pickup, and lock myself in there. And as my dad tells me now, after sometimes hours of pleading with me and lots of crying on my part, I reluctantly opened the door and would let him in, kind of take my licks, and then we went on home. And that happened over and over again. And so that's my connection. That's what brought me to where I am today. That's why I'm a refuge manager. In tears as a kid, they're not wanting to go home, wanting to stay out there with the wildlife, being able to see deer and elk every day as I was out there. And so that's what brought me there today. And so it made me start to think about where, you know, these managers are going to come from in the future and what's going to be their passion, what's going to be their drive. And so, you know, I have to warn you all, I look at the world through a very different perspective now than I did 10, 15 years ago. I look at it through the eyes of a dad. I have 5 kids, this being one of them. This is Solis, he's number 3. And so because of that and that perspective that I have now, I'm constantly looking, what are the things that I am doing that are going to affect the way he perceives the world and the way that he is going to perceive our national wildlife refuges, and what is his connection going to be with wildlife? And so, you know, I would have loved to have had my dad be a refuge manager. He wasn't. Solis's is. And so he has some opportunities that many other kids don't have. And so I look at that and I see those opportunities that he has, going out and banding snow geese with us and getting that connection and developing that passion, that love for wildlife. And I wonder, where are these other kids that don't have the same opportunity? Where are they going to get that same passion, that same love, that sense of ownership of these wild places? Where's that going to come from? And I, again, go back to my responsibility as a manager today. What are the things that I can do to make sure that our national wildlife refuges are an inviting place, a place that's welcoming? Had a conversation last week with one of my staff very much about what I'm going to stand here and talk to you about today. And we discussed my background. He told me his background. He grew up hunting snow geese at Bosque del Apache Refuge in New Mexico. And he said that's kind of where his conservation ethic, where his care and love for wildlife refuges came, because he went and he got to see refuges from the inside. And so that really stuck with me. That is really what I want to do as a manager. I want people to be able to experience refuges from the inside, be able to truly experience them, be able to taste them, smell them, feel them, hear them, truly experience, not be this place that there's a big fence that you can see from the outside and not truly know and feel and know what it's like to hold a snow goose in your hand. Know what it's like to pull the trigger on a big buck. Know what it's like to have the dangling of that rod as you're bringing in a fish in a young kid. To know those experiences. And so again, going back to my responsibility, how can I create those things? Well, I'd say I can get creative. There's ways of balancing those priorities, balancing those needs that we have for wildlife and making sure wildlife comes first. But again, I step back and I go to what is our mission statement with the Fish and Wildlife Service, is protecting all those special places and those critters. And at the very end, for the benefit of the American people. We don't protect these places for the benefit of critters. We protect them for the benefit of the American people. And so I take that very, very seriously, and I look at what are ways that I can balance those priorities? What are ways that I can do that? I can bring my son. I can bring a scout group out. I can bring a classroom out to our refuge and engage them in the activities that we're doing, making sure that they know why we're doing what we're doing, why it's important, and why they should care about these wild places. Or maybe it's being able to open new areas to fishing, open other areas to photography, just allowing people to be able to see and experience these refuges from the inside. I learned a very valuable lesson by taking my son Solis out here to band snow geese with me. I just thought this is something really cool I can do as a dad. We had a scout group out that same time banding geese, and said, you know, bring him out to join in, and they had a blast. He was probably about 4 years old. He learned real quick that you need to hold the head of the snow goose down, if not they like to bite. And so, you know, he learned that lesson, but he taught me a lesson that came later on. A couple weeks later, as we're going back to the refuge, driving through, and he sees that same flock of snow geese that we banded out on the refuge. Whoa, 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 stop, he's telling me. And so we stop. And he's telling me, whoa, I got to check on my snow geese. And so that's what I want to be able to see, is how can we make that connection to get that sense of ownership, that sense of responsibility that he had, that he has to stop and check on his snow geese. I think if we do that and we create that sense of ownership, that sense of responsibility, there will be refuge managers of the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaun. Again, challenging us to be creative in how we bring people to refuges. There's some common patterns here. So next we have Mr. Don Hultman. Welcome, Don Hultman.
Common patterns, what the hell am I doing here? It is an honor to be here and invited to this conference, and I think they invited me because I live pretty close and it won't cost them hardly anything. Okay, now I got to get on script because we're going to run out of time. We all know that the future implies change, and really change, as we all know, is the only constant in our lives. Just a few examples and see if you can remember some of these. And if you can, we know where you stand on the charts up there. Remember when a mouse was just an animal? When metapopulations didn't exist and wildlife didn't care? When a Dodge Power Wagon was the only four-wheel drive vehicle on a refuge? When you could count on one hand the number of women and minority managers in the refuge system? When there were refuge clerks and most of them were men? When Twitters and tweets were something you heard on bird surveys only? Well, I could go on and on with these, but because there's been lots of changes in the last 30-plus years, and we know there'll be a lot of changes in the future, but how are refuges going to be different? Well, frankly, we don't know. I don't think anyone could have predicted the profound technological changes we've seen in the last 30 years, and who knows what it's going to be like the next 30 years. Like the famous quote attributed to statistician George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We do know, though, that the art of management leadership involves some constants that transcend the societal and political change that you're all going to experience in the coming years. So rather than predict the future for you, which is probably folly, I'd like to offer a little bit of advice. I have a sign in my house, and it reads, "Live simply, laugh often, love deeply." And I thought, well, maybe I'll do that for this. So I'd like to expound on those just briefly a little bit. First, live simply. It's critical for the modern and future manager to simplify the growing complexity of the workplace and the issues faced. In a recent book I read, The Social Animal by David Brooks, he's the columnist for the New York Times, he had a story about a group of former prominent government leaders that gathered at a retreat. Now they were out of power and mostly out of influence. And they, as a whole, were pretty unremarkable. But what made them special was a common trait. They were known for their ability to simplify complex issues so that all could understand them. I used to have a sign when I worked in the regional office on the door that said, "Simplify, focus, communicate, execute, and communicate some more." Second, laugh often. Managing national wildlife refuges and waterfowl productions is critical, important work, but it is also hilarious at times. Just think, refuges is a large organization within a larger agency, within a larger department, within the purview of the political party in charge. As a colleague of mine said when I worked at Tamarack Refuge early in my career, the only problem I have with the Fish and Wildlife Service is the Fish and Wildlife Service. Large organizations can, however, whether they're private or government, drive you crazy, as you all know. Lots of policy, lots of process. I doubt it will change for the manager of the future. So what you cannot change, laugh about. I complained much in my career, but I also offered a solution with almost every one of my complaints, along with a bit of sarcastic humor, I hope. So, roll with the punches, speak up when appropriate, but never take yourself or your agency too seriously. Third, and most importantly, love deeply. Make no mistake, work on refuges in the past, now, and in the future is all about love. We have accomplished great things with scant funding because of a passion for the resource and a passion for these amazing places of mystery and magic. Just listen to some of the names. Okefenokee, Malheur, Charles M. Russell, Agassiz, Chincoteague, Kodiak, Arctic, Seney, Noxubee, Bosque del Apache, and so many more. So here are 3 points to ponder about love for the resource and refuges. First point, managers need a passion for public service. We do noble work despite the disparaging things that politicians and the media sometimes say, and mostly recently. As I fully realized when I retired 2 years ago, it is a true gift to spend your life on a cause greater than yourself, on behalf of creatures that have no voice, and in service to fellow Americans. Let no one ever convince you otherwise. Second point, managers will need a passion for refuge visitors and the public at large. These lands that we are charged with caring for are not ours, they're theirs. When you hear someone say, my refuge or my program, be wary. The deed to these lands say United States of America and belong to everyone, even those people we don't appreciate or like their opinions very much. Refuge visitors need to feel welcome and guided to enjoyment of their lands and waters. Have a bit of empathy as you plan your outreach and visitor services programs. Love the people who come to refuges and waterfowl production areas, and they will learn to love the resource. Finally, managers will need a passion for good management and leadership. On-the-job experience is essential, training is helpful, but become a student of management and leadership on your own. Keep up on the literature, read history, read corporate management books, mentor and be mentored, develop a relationship with other good managers and leaders, manage effectively downward and upward in the organization. One of my favorite management leadership quotes comes from Jim Autry in the book For Love and Profit. He wrote, "Good management is a calling, a life engagement that, if done properly, combines technical and administrative skills with vision, compassion, honesty, and trust to create an environment in which people can grow personally, can feel fulfilled, can contribute to the common good, and can share in the psychic and financial rewards of a job well done. Management is, in fact, a sacred trust in which the well-being of other people is put in your care during most of their waking hours." So there's what I think the manager of the future needs to face, and striving to work simply in a complex world, laughing despite the trials and tribulations of government service, and keeping a love and passion for the land, the wildlife, and the National Wildlife Refuge System. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Don, and thanks to all the panel members for sharing your insights and your wonderful stories. So now we're going to open it up to questions, and I'll ask people to raise your hand. If we select you to ask the question, please come up to the microphone and say the question there. And it can be to an individual panel member or to the group. We can do it either way, but let's open it up for questions. So who has a question? Come on, guys. I know there's some questions. You've got a wonderful panel of veterans and early career employees here, and there's all sorts of things that we think about and talk about. Yes, on the second row there. Yeah, say your name and ask the question, please.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, good. I can't hear myself. That's what it is. So I'm Shavia Horton with Paranagate, and to be honest, that's my boss sitting right there. So I'm going to help him out, Shaun Sanchez. I just wanted to offer questions to the panel and see what plans you currently have or may have in the future for implementing some of the things you talked about today. Is there anything going right now, or did I just put you on the spot?
Okay, so any panel member want to take that question?
We're having this conversation now about urban refuges, and so I do have a plan in that pie chart of there's only 13 people that have 31 years or longer. I'm one of the 13, so I have a little while to go to retirement, and I do plan on making an urban refuge where I'm able to engage this non-traditional community for refuge management and try to get kids on the refuge, so yes.
one of the things that, that I see that's within my purview or my ability in, in making sure that people can engage on refuges can be as simple as the design on a boardwalk. And now I'm not taking credit for this at all because it was done prior to my tenure there, but out at Ash Meadows Refuge within the complex, many boardwalks that I've seen, we have kind of this barrier to make sure that we keep people out of wherever we're not wanting them to go. And my first trip out to Ash Meadows Refuge, I noticed that the boardwalk and the platform that gets right next to King's Pool is very low and pretty inviting, as my kids found out real quickly, that pretty inviting for them to get down and touch that water and get in there and see all of the Amargosa pupfish that are down there. And so when I was there with the manager, Sharon, she asked me, do you like that or think that's a good thing? And I said, well, Sharon, every time I go out to our refuge, I make sure I take extra clothes for my kids, because that is what's important to me, making sure that they can get down and they can touch that water and they can feel the warmthness coming up in that King's Pool spring, and that they can go down and there's not this barrier to them. So those are the things, maybe very small and subtle, but allowing that ability for us to really connect people with their refuges.
Wonderful.
I guess I would say with some of my items were kind of big ticket items, so right now is the time with the implementation teams providing the comments to them and try to help just raise awareness and maybe make some change in the future. So that's what I would do with that.
Okay. Other questions on the front row? Yes.
Hi, Steve Delahanty from Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, and I was blessed to begin my career in that 485 Refuge Manager Series and have enjoyed it very much, but there's another argument to have people start in a different job series and develop a love for that management, and then switch into that series. So I'm wondering how what the panel would recommend about, do we try and bring in GS 5 and 7 485 series folks, or do we bring them in somewhere else and slide them into the manager series?
Yeah, great question. Who wants to take that one? Don?
I think you should take people with great potential for management and leadership wherever you find them. I mean, I started my career as a file clerk with the Internal Revenue Service, and, they let me work 30 years, so. But I started as an outdoor rec planner, which we don't have anymore as a job series, I don't think, or maybe there's a few still out there, but, and switched over and then started moving a lot. But so I don't think it really matters. I think we need to do everything, use all the tools to reach good people, and certainly, but I think we do need more 485 lower graded positions on refuges. It's something we've lost. They're always the first to go, and then we don't have that feeder group to learn and grow like a lot of us had an opportunity.
Other panel members? Okay, Barry.
Barry Stiglitz, project leader for the Hawaiian and Pacific Islands National Wildlife Refuge Complex. You're going to expect me to start with aloha, but I'm going to start with hafa in honor of one of my colleagues from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Ike Cabrera, president of the Friends of the Monument. Ike, are you back there? This gentleman, I think, has traveled farther than anyone else to come to the conference this week. Thank you, Ike. I did that to him because he made me come up here and ask a question. Are we still good, Ike? I very much appreciate the panel's information. The one thing that I was hoping to hear but did not, and I will ask you for your opinions on if you don't mind, is that generally those of us managing refuges weren't the first people to be in the places where those refuges are. Was that too esoteric? And many indigenous cultures were actively suppressed over the years, and there's been a renaissance in Hawaii since the 1970s and other places. And so I believe, and I'm interested in your opinion, that an acknowledgement and sensitivity to those indigenous cultures is very important. We're talking about having a demographically more diverse United States, and part of the United States is the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas America and Samoa and Guam. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Excellent question. Anybody want to respond to that?
I worked at Yukon Delta Refuge in Alaska, and any of you know, there's 56 native Yupik Eskimo villages, either within the boundaries or in the right in the periphery, but basically rely on the refuge for maintaining a subsistence lifestyle. And one of the things that I know Doug Stoller, who I don't know if he's in here or not, but Doug Stoller and Mike Reardon I think was really the big champion of, in Alaska there's the ANSET program, the Alaska Native Science and Engineering program, and it was something that Mike Reardon saw to make sure that one of the things I got totally convinced of in my time in Alaska was that you know, even though I might fit one of those minority boxes, they don't want to see me out there on the Delta. We need people, Yupik people, managing that National Wildlife Refuge. And so we became very big supporters. The manager, Gene Peltola out there, is Alaska Native, Yupik. We became very big supporters of the ANSET program and making sure that we cultivated those relationships with the communities. I myself, when I called up the ANSET coordinator at U of A, I asked her specifically, I want to know the kids that were from the villages within the Delta, because I wanted them working on the refuge. And so it really helped us to bridge a lot of those relationships. I think the future of it is, you know, I think we need a diverse management of the refuge. The entire staff needs to be from diverse backgrounds, but I think there needs to be a much more local influence in making sure that we have those, the input from that community.
Thanks, Shaun. Any other panel members want to respond to that one? Okay, another question? Kevin?
Good morning. Kevin Forster from Upper Miss Refuge. This question is not for you, Don Hultman, just clarifying that. First, I want to start with this, a shameless self-promotion of QR codes on the t-shirt here. There'll be a workshop on this afternoon. You can find out about them. It does relate to leadership and the future refuge managers. My question, though, is for Keenan and a few others. I appreciate what you said earlier. What I'm taking from what I heard from you is you made a connection with somebody, and that's why you're here. You went to school, played football, did your thing. You made a connection with somebody. It might have started with Dean Rundle, might have started with Maury, as you mentioned. But that really, in my mind, outlies the human element associated with it. And you're looking to those folks as being mentors in the future and so on. I'd just like for you to expand a little bit more on what that meant to you and how we can do that with more folks. The importance of mentoring and making that connection with others.
Yeah, thanks for your question. How can we do more of that? I think it's pretty easy. Just identify somebody, take the time on it. We get very busy with the data calls and the end of the year spending and just all the things that we get inundated with as managers. But taking the time to find somebody, be it a YCC employee, an SCA, when you get these requests to mentor people from the region, as we do in Region 4, take them up on that. It's time consuming, but it can be very rewarding. So just take the time, make it formal. I know Lynn Askins has talked to me about she's taken on a few people that she's looking for to meet a conference with, and that's very important. And taking time to have conversations. Charlie is extremely busy, but he always takes the time in the morning to sit and crack a joke about how big I am or something like that. And but in all seriousness, just take the time. I think that's the easy answer to that question.
Great, Keenan. Thank you. Okay, we got about 5 minutes until 12, and I would like to get us out on time or close to on time. And I want to ask a question of the panel members, ask each of them to respond, something that we talked about a lot as we were preparing for this and thinking about important things to address. But it hasn't come up here, so I'll just make it a question if each of you would take a shot at it. And the question would be, you know, we've talked a lot about moving around and developing ourselves, you know, as professionals and broad perspectives and gaining those skills to be a manager. So the question would be, do you think the service has the right policies and programs in place regarding employee mobility? Because I see that as a balance that we strike, and I think probably everybody in this room has felt that balance of family and connection with place and the tug of professional development and the tradition of mobility. So a lot of that comes down to our policies. So if each of you might respond, do you think we have the right policies and the right programs in place to strike that right balance with mobility? So let's, Vicki, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I worked at Cullum Wetland Management District, which is a very small town, and we bought a house there when we lived there, and we stayed there for 2 years. Half the reason we bought that house was because we knew there was the chance that they would buy the house back. Well, at that time, it was, I think, inferred. Right 2 months before we were getting ready to move, that move policy changed, where then it was no longer a guarantee that you would do that. I think things like this do affect us. Now, I don't think that we need to buy everybody's house. I don't think that's the answer. I think we need to look at it more broadly and figure out what would be the best way to do this, because this does impact us directly. And our families moving across the country from place to place, we want people to be able to go to these remote stations, and sometimes the housing is really difficult to find. And so I think the move just needs to be looked at in general.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. Who wants to go next? Keenan?
With the performance plan or your developmental plan, I think that's important to get details in your plan to different regions and different places to get experience. So I think we're doing well there, but being flexible. I know it's difficult to lose your deputy or your wildlife refuge specialist for a month or so, but I would ask within house, be flexible and allow your people to go and get different experiences, and that might help encourage movement within the agency.
Thanks, Keenan.
When I started out, I remember talking to Refuge supervisor, and he was explaining to me that I needed to move every 2 or 3 years, and I just could not understand it. I thought if you started me out, my hometown, the Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge, you started me out there, and after 20, 30 years, I would be the best possible manager there was. I knew everything about that refuge. I've learned very different since then. I would not be the manager today than I am. Hopefully I'm good. Without having all those very diverse experiences. And the move policy, that's what has enabled me, having that sense of security and being able to move. But I'm caught up in it also. I have a house in Texas and Nevada because I got stuck in the mess there. So it's something that I think is important to make sure that we can find, whether it's creative ways through details, finding ways of diversifying experience. I think it's extremely important that people move around to diversify that experience, particularly if you're going to be a manager. So whatever we can do, I know it's broken right now in some aspects. We need to be able to improve it and fix it.
Thanks, Shaun.
I support moving. Just one example, I think, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule anymore. In fact, the rules changed when my career started at the end about Washington experience. I don't know what it meant anymore. Did you need it? Don't you need it? And so I think that's all changed, and I don't know if the services articulated it very well to the employees. But what really matters, and the point I want to make, I worked in both Washington and a regional office, and I can tell you, as a manager then at the end of my career at a place like Upper Miss, that experience was invaluable for what I did there, and I don't think I could have gotten some things done without that experience. And mostly it's not as much the experience as the contacts you make. And those contacts in the regional office and Washington office give you the support when the political heat gets hot to get some things done. So it's a value that in the end makes it more effective for the resource to get that broad experience in the big offices.
I support moving. That sounds like the answer from somebody with a communications degree. Yeah. Okay, yes.
So happy you brought that up, Larry. My name's Carol Damberg. I'm at Sacramento Regional Office right now. But in regards to those that go to Washington, Larry, you've been there for a little bit, and I know Don went there, but, and I'm not going to, this actually is, I think, the idea of my spouse, Doug Damberg, service couple, you know, we talk. So anyway, we have a right of return from Alaska, and you know, the whole idea of going into Washington can be a little bit intimidating and fearful of whether or not you will ever come out. We all know the experience is really good and that you will learn from it, but the thought process of, you know, Alaska, people may not ever come back from there, and there's a reason for that, but I think that the consideration of that in the future about trying to encourage people to get to Washington, because it is where a lot of things happen, and you'll be challenged and out of your comfort zone, I'm assuming, more than you'll ever be, but then to be able to get them back out in the field if that's where they want to go. So just thoughts on that, Larry?
Well, I'm the moderator. I'm not supposed to give opinions. Well, I think that's a great question, and I would say one of the best things that people can do if they have any interest in Washington at all is to come in on a detail. We do those all the time, and I think the big benefit is it removes a lot of the mystery about what Washington, D.C. is like. So anybody interested in a detail, contact me, and I'll help set that up for you. We do that a lot. The idea of right of return, and you know, there's been a long-term discussion about Washington level of experience and how that relates to leadership throughout the service. Should it be required or should it not? I know the 7 or 8 years I've been in Washington, there's been a constant dialogue on that. And you know, there's never been a policy clearly one way or the other. So I think it's a real issue, and I hope that coming out of this vision effort, you know, we've got some strong directives to look at leadership development. We used to have the Leadership Development Council that worked on exactly that sort of thing, but they never specifically cracked that nut. So I think it's a fresh time to look at it. And I would also say that in 2009, we did a survey of service employees about mobility and leadership development. Some really interesting statistics that came up there. It's on the Refuge System webpage under careers, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's got a summary at the beginning that talks about incentives and disincentives to relocating. So what motivates people, what sort of incentives might be offered to improve mobility and that sort of thing, and it gives a lot of good insights. I personally think we could look at some of that data and we could structure a program that would probably encourage more mobility or maybe more targeted mobility and get us a little further down the road with leadership development. Panel members, any responses to that question?
Jared was the exception. We had to force him out. He was. You know, I just want to make one more comment about, you know, mobility, because from my viewpoint as a refuge supervisor for a long time and seeing lots of supervising managers, you know, there were managers that were at stations for 20, 25 years, and they were doing great innovative things up until, you know, they retired. And so there's really no hard and fast rule. You know, it takes years sometimes to get something big accomplished on a refuge, and I think a lot of you in this room know that. So there's no hard and fast rule. And then other people, you know, go to a station for a few years and then they sort of hit a plateau and they're not too motivated anymore. And they should probably move. But I've seen it, I guess, all.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. Okay, well, we're at lunchtime, and we're going to wrap it up. I want to say that, you know, we talked a lot about refuge managers. We talked about the statistics I showed, where they're all 45 series. I hope a lot of these insights are just as valuable to people working in other occupations. I know there's all sorts of people in the room here, and I hope it was valuable to everybody here. So thanks, everybody. How about a round of applause for the panel?